Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Engage in Exchange, lengthy sentences and a second look at injustice. And before we really kick off the program, I would just like to remind you, well, first of all, hello and welcome. My name is Vanessa Antone. I'm NACDL Senior Resource Counsel, and many of you are return participants to the Engage in Exchange series, and we thank you for that. For those who might be joining us for the first time, I want to remind you to please keep your microphone muted and keep your camera off until such time as you participate and are invited to join the discussion. This is so everybody can get a great view of our speakers and the PowerPoint. And we're recording this so that your friends and colleagues and everyone else who was not able to make it at this particular time is also going to have the benefit of that. We definitely encourage you to ask questions through the chat, so please do that. And without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline Goodman to kick off this program on behalf of our speakers and the Decarceration Committee. If you have any other technical questions, please go ahead and send them to me in the chat. Jackie,
Great,
thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good morning and afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second installment of our three-part series on mass incarceration in the United States. My name is Jacqueline Goodman, and I'm the chair of the Decarceration Committee of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. We bring you this important and timely series as we join allies across the nation in recognizing the injustice of 50 years of mass incarceration. These Engage in Exchange webinars are interactive discussions with the nation's leading authorities on criminal justice reform. And one of the most brilliant and widely respected is today's guest and a decarceration ally, Dr. Nazgol Ghandnoosh. Dr. Ghandnoosh is the co-director of research at the Sentencing Project, the think tank responsible for reshaping Americans' perspective on crime and punishment. Her research has been featured in major media outlets, of course, including the Washington Post, New York Times, and literally every media outlet. Her dedication to the criminal legal reform movement is truly inspiring, and we're honored to have her with us here today. Our host and facilitator today is my friend and colleague, Seth Chazin. Seth is a criminal justice advocate and a San Francisco criminal defense attorney. For many years, Seth has been an active bar leader in California and nationally. He sits on the board of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and he's an active member of this Decarceration Committee. I'm looking very much forward to today's discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Seth.
Thank you, Jackie, and welcome everybody. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce and to have us listen to Dr. Ghandnoosh. She just does amazing, fantastic work, and you're about to hear from her, and you will see how interesting and articulate she is in describing and breaking down this very serious problem we have in this country with mass incarceration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ghandnoosh. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Seth, and thank you, Jackie. Thanks to you both for all your service to NACDL, as well as to all the audience that's joined us. And thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you today. So what I want to talk about today is, let me try to share my slides with you. I'm going to give you an overview on recent trends in decarceration and with lengthy sentences, and also talk about racial disparities and specifically how these two issues are connected. This is a chart that is a sculpture of a chart, actually, at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is a museum and historic site in Philadelphia. That has an exhibit about mass incarceration that the Sentencing Project advised on. And this is a sculpture that they've created that shows the growth in the prison population in the United States. So every bar here represents the count from one period within a decade of incarceration. So it shows the incarceration rate starting from the 1900s to 2020. And it's one way of seeing the dramatic growth in the prison population, starting from the 1970s and showing where we are today. And you can see here, what is one way of seeing the 50 years of growth in mass incarceration that we've experienced, which includes a bit of decarceration that has happened. And so you can see that the last bar for 2020 is somewhat lower than the incarceration rate for 2010. So I can't be a sculptor, but I can offer you a chart that projects out from what the chart that the sculpture is based on. It projects out what things will look like if we continue doing what we have been doing. And what we have been doing has been successful in reducing the prison population somewhat. So there's been a 25% reduction in the prison population since it reached its peak level in 2009. And part of that is because of the more significant gains that we made in terms of reducing the prison population during the early years of the COVID-19 pandemic. But so overall, we've reduced the prison population by 25%. And that's actually, if you average that out, per year, that's been about a 2% reduction in the prison population each year. If we keep going at that rate, this is what I will be, or future researchers will be presenting in terms of what the incarceration levels look like in the United States. And this chart shows that if we keep going at this rate of decarceration, it's going to take us until 2098 to get back to the prison population level that we had in 1972, which was before the era of mass incarceration. So it would take us 75 years to undo what we've been doing in the past 5 decades. And I think probably most of us on this webinar would agree that that pace of progress is too slow. We don't want to have to wait that long to undo the injustices and undo the ineffective policies that we've come up with and that we're still living amongst. So I do want to mention, though, that even though the overall pace of decarceration is much slower than we would like it to be, it's actually been quite substantial in a couple of states. And so this is a chart that shows you how much the prison population has declined since it reached its peak level for states that have decarcerated more than the US average. So the bar on the bottom is a 25% reduction in the total US prison population. And all the jurisdictions listed here have done more than that to reduce their prison populations. And so some of the leaders in decarceration include Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. And these are states that have reduced their prison populations by 50% or more since reaching their peak levels. So that's pretty substantial, but there's still a long way to go because those peak levels were quite high. We need to get closer to 70, 80, 90% reduction in the prison population in order to end mass incarceration. And those numbers sound really astoundingly high, perhaps to you, and they sound very high to me, but it's been helpful to me to think about what's been happening in the youth justice system, where there's been a lot more progress in reducing the number of youth that are confined. And in particular, if we look at the number of youth confined from the year 2000 till 2020, the reduction there is from 109,000 to 25,000. So that's a 77% decline in the youth justice system. So these levels of decarceration that we have in mind we're beginning to approach that level in the youth justice system, and we need to carry over those kinds of levels of decarceration in the adult system. So why have we not had a bigger dent in reducing the prison population? And I think that the answer to that question is partly within the answer to this question that I want to pose to you all as the audience members. And I would love it if you would just write into the chat what your best guess is in response to this question. What proportion of the prison population is serving time for a drug offense? So please note that I'm asking about the prison population, people serving a sentence typically of a year or longer. And I want to know what your estimate is and what your sense is of how many people in prisons around the country have a drug conviction as their most serious conviction. And thank you so much to those of you who are putting in answers, and I'll read some of them. So far I see a range of 40 to 65%. Let me wait for a few more answers. Someone has a very precise guess of 47.78%. Okay, so we're still, most of the guesses so far are within the 40 to 65% range. And this is often the range that I get answers that I hear from folks, including people like yourselves who work within the criminal justice system. Are you ready for the answer? Okay, someone guessed 35, 25%. The answer is 17%. If you look at the 1.2 million people in prison right now, and you look at what their most serious conviction was, only 17% have a drug conviction as their most serious offense. In contrast, 56% of them have a violent crime as their most serious offense, and 12% have a property crime as the most serious offense. So let me just say that that number is probably, that proportion of that are there for a drug conviction is probably lower than you would expect based on your answers here. But I do want to just say that the impact of the drug war is broader than I've just suggested with that number. And that's because, let's say someone is on community supervision, got a probation sentence for an assault, for example, and they are caught with drugs on their system, and that results in a probation revocation. That's because of the drug war that they're ultimately landing in prison, but they would be counted as being there for the underlying offense, assault, as their most serious crime. So I did want to note that. But when you look at the underlying offenses, most people in prison are there for a violent crime as their most serious offense. And here's a chart that illustrates that. So this is a chart that basically breaks down that chart showing the growth in the prison population, and it breaks it down by offense type. And you can see that the line at the top is violent convictions. That's the number of people in prison with a violent conviction as their most serious offense. And the lower lines are drugs and property convictions. So because that line at the top is violent convictions, that's one way that you can see that the largest population in prison is there for a violent crime. And what this chart is showing you is that how much progress we've made in reducing the prison population by offense type. We've only reduced the prison population serving time for violent crime by 10% since it reached its peak in 2009. In contrast, we've made a nearly 50% reduction for nonviolent crimes in terms of how many people are in prison. We still have a long way to go, but that's where most of the progress has been, understandably, because that's where there's been the most receptiveness among the public and policymakers to undo some of the injustices of mass incarceration. But the point that I want to impress upon you with this chart is that we can't end mass incarceration if we just focus on nonviolent crimes. We have to also scale back the number of people in prison for violent crimes. And the two ways to do that are to reduce admissions for violent crimes and to reduce sentence lengths. And I'll talk a little bit about why it makes sense to do that. But let me also just point out that, in terms of how does this chart compare to crime rates, as many of you probably know, crime rates have been coming up, in particular homicides have been climbing up in the last couple of years. But before we got to this point, and even still, overall crime rates are much lower than they were when they reached their peak levels in the 1990s. So that's when homicides, violent crimes, property crimes reached their peak rates. And since then, between then and 2019, there's been about a 50% reduction in crime rates across the board around the country. And that's a trend that we've seen around the world. Many other countries, even though they start with lower levels of violent crime than we have, experienced an uptick in crime in the 70s, 80s, and then in the 90s, that started to turn around. We're the only country that responded to that uptick in crime rates with mass incarceration. And we continue to increase our prison populations, even as crime rates were falling. And so I think that's really important to note how anomalous we are globally in terms of the mass incarceration problem that we have, but also that it started off with a reaction to a problem that was happening around the world, which is rising crime in the 1980s until the mid-90s. And so I mentioned that part of the goal of reducing violent crime, the population in prison with a violent conviction, part of the way of doing that is that we need to reduce sentence lengths. And so to give you a sense of how extreme and excessive prison terms are, I want to make sure that you understand what's going on with life sentences. And based on my colleague Ashley Nellis's work at the Sentencing Project, we know that 1 in 7 people in US prisons now, over 200,000 people, are serving life sentences. That's more people serving a life sentence in the United States than people were imprisoned for any kind of offense in 1970. We have a larger population serving life sentences than 1970's total prison population. And so we at the Sentencing Project for a couple of years have had a campaign to end life imprisonment and to limit prison terms in almost all cases to 20 years. And why does that make sense? And I want to go through some of that, the research that would support this kind of a change in prison sentencing. So the reasons for this, just to give you a quick overview, have to do with the fact that extreme sentencing is counterproductive to public safety. So I'm not even just saying that it's not effective. I want to actually make the argument for you that it's counterproductive. It works against our goals of advancing public safety. And the reasons for this have to do with the fact that lengthy sentences are not effective for, at some point they become ineffective for getting us to reasonable levels of recidivism. I'll talk to you about that. They are not effective deterrents. I'll share with you some information about that. And they also divert our attention and resources away from much more effective investments in public safety. And I'll share with you about that as well. So let's start off with recidivism. This is just a list of a number of publications that you might want to consult. So these are some sources that I'm going to base this on, which is that we know from research that the Bureau of Justice Statistics has done that when people are released from prison for violent crimes, compared to when they're released from prison for drug offenses or property crimes, the population that's released for violent convictions tend to have lower recidivism rates than the population that served time for other offenses. And that has to do partly with the fact that people who go in with a violent conviction tend to serve longer sentences. So, but at some point, we hit the point where recidivism rates have fallen enough so that the people in prison that we're continuing to hold behind bars do not pose a greater public safety risk than others in our communities, and yet we continue to incarcerate them. So when we look at recidivism rates for people that were imprisoned for decades for the most serious crimes that were released either as a result of being resentenced from juvenile life without parole sentences, that were paroled after parole eligible life sentences, or that were released as a result of other kinds of reforms, such as with the Ungers in Maryland, the Unger versus Maryland case. When we look at how people do after they're released from decades of imprisonment, we see that this is a population that has the absolute lowest recidivism rates of anybody released from prison. And that's because they've served such lengthy sentences. And that means that we've been keeping them behind bars far longer than is necessary, and that there are many others like them that we can release and also see that they are able to thrive in our communities and that are able to, at the very least, have a minimal reoffense rate when they're released. Okay, so that's about recidivism. Let me talk a bit about deterrence. So someone might think, well, never mind the recidivism rate of the person who committed the very serious offense. What about deterrence? What about threatening other people with these sentences and preventing them from committing crime? There's some, I can see the intuitive appeal of that argument, but when you actually look at research on how deterrence works, the evidence is very clear that extreme sentences are not very effective deterrents. And this is a quote from Daniel Nagin from Carnegie Mellon University. He's a very notable criminologist, former president of the American Society of Criminology. And what he wrote is that increases in already long prison sentences, say from 20 years to life, do not have material deterrent effects on crime. And he has done lengthy reviews of research on this topic. and is very clear. This is a sort of a consensus among criminologists that these extreme sentences are not effective deterrents. And why is that? The reason for that is a couple different things. First, people don't expect to be caught for their crime. And that's not even an unreasonable expectation. If you look at homicide clearance rates, for example, in many parts of the country, they're under 60%. In many cases, people get away with murder. Even with the most serious crime that we dedicate the most resources to, we don't have a very high clearance rate, and many people are getting away with it. And so when people commit very serious crimes, they don't expect to face the very serious life without parole and other kinds of extreme sentences that we might threaten them with. The other reason that extreme sentences don't work as deterrents is that people are often committing crimes under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or not aware of the sentence that they may face. And that's especially true, for example, in felony murder cases where someone might be an assistant to helping a friend commit a robbery, something goes wrong, the victim is unfortunately killed. They know hardly anyone in our society, I think, understands that in that situation in many parts of the country, if you were the getaway driver or the lookout and something went wrong in a crime that you were participating in and someone died, you could face a life without parole sentence. So that's another reason that these kinds of extreme sentences are not effective deterrents. So what is effective? These kinds of programs that I've got listed here, which are extremely under-resourced and not scaled up to where they should be. So we know that many people commit crimes under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and yet we don't have universal access to affordable and effective substance use treatment. That would go a long way to preventing criminal activity. We know that community-based violence prevention programs are effective. There's been evaluations done of these programs, and yet they're not nearly scaled up to the point that they need to be. Similarly, with crisis intervention programs, early childhood education, we don't have universal preschool in our country, universal high-quality preschool. We don't have therapeutic support for youth who need mental health care. These are the kinds of programs and policies that we should be dramatically scaling up instead of diverting resources to extreme penalties. So in terms of how do we address this problem that I've outlined, one solution is second look reforms. And this is a recommendation that actually the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code has made, which is that everyone in prison should get a second look, a judicial second look at their sentence. For people who committed their crimes under the age of 18, they recommend after 10 years. And for people who committed their crimes at age 18 or older, they recommend a second look at the sentence after 15 years. And the way that they present that is that this is something that would help to address the evolving norms and scientific understanding that we have about how extreme sentencing is cruel and ineffective. And so as they note in the discussions around the Model Penal Code, many of the people that were part of the process of making this recommendation actually recommended that a second look begin even before 15 years, even before 10 years for some. The recommendation was that courts should be able to reassess and determine if people are still public safety risks as soon as possible and as frequently as possible to decide if incarceration is necessary. And so we at the Sentencing Project put out a report a couple of years ago called A Second Look at Injustice, and on its cover is William Underwood and his daughter Ebony Underwood. I'm very proud now to have William Underwood as a colleague at the Sentencing Project, and his daughter Ebony Underwood is one of our board members and had been on our board while Mr. Underwood was still incarcerated. And he was the person that when Cory Booker introduced the Second Look bill initially a couple of years ago, it was partly named after William Underwood. And so there are so many others like him in the federal system and across the country that are incarcerated into old age, that are waiting to be reunited with their children, with their family members. And we're excited to see a growing movement around this reform. So in the report, I describe the prosecutor-initiated resentencing that's happened in California, and the number of people that have been released there so far, thanks to prosecutors recommending resentencing, but also the reform in Washington, D.C. that allows people to directly petition the courts for resentencing. And D.C.'s law currently, initially it was just for people who were convicted under the age of 18, who had served 20 years. That time limit was reduced to, that requirement of time served was reduced to 15 years before people could petition. And then the law was expanded to people who were convicted as emerging adults and allowed them to petition after 15 years of imprisonment for crimes committed under the age of 25. And most recently, the DC Council has expanded the law to allow everyone to petition for resentencing after 15, 20 years of imprisonment. But unfortunately, DC does not have full autonomy in making its own laws. And so Congress overturned the larger package that included that reform. And so we're hoping to see that advanced again. And so I also wanted to make sure that you know that prosecutor-initiated resentencing is not just happening in California now, also in Illinois, Louisiana, Oregon, and Washington State. And the Organization for the People has some terrific material about the prosecutor-initiated resentencing work that's taking place and the movement to expand that around the country. And our organization, the Sentencing Project, now has a Second Look network that's being led by Becky Feldman. And this is a network of attorneys and organizations that are working on implementing Second Look reforms and are trying to expand these laws in other parts of the country. And so if you're interested, please reach out and we'll help you to apply to become part of that network. So I'm going to change gears now and talk a bit about racial disparities in incarceration. But before I start to give you my overview about this topic, I would love again to have your feedback in the chat about what you think are the key drivers of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And so tell me what are the major sources of it, and then I will share with you a sort of framework that I think encapsulates most of the sources, but I would love to get your insights first. I promise this is an easier question than the last one I asked, because as you know, there are many different sources of disparity. Over-policing. So that's one response. Please feel free to share others. I'll wait another 15 seconds or so for your responses before proceeding. Wealth inequality, great. Great, Jackie's going to cover most of them for us. Implicit bias, thank you, Jackie. Our history. Okay, so let me show you some of the information that I have put together on this. Great, thank you so much. Others are chiming in. Trial penalty, socioeconomic disparities. Oh, great, there's more folks answering. Lack of familiar support, great. History of slavery, great. So let me show you the way that I typically frame this, this kind of discussion is to start off by saying that, you know, to tackle racial disparities in the criminal justice system, we need to weed out the sources that are within the justice system, and you've been talking about several of them. And then and we also need to address the sources of disparity that are beyond the criminal justice system. And so the way I present this is to say, what I'm showing you on the left is homicide victimization rates by race. And you can see that Black Americans are much more likely to be victims of homicide than white Americans. Homicide is also an intra-racial crime. People typically kill other people of the same race and ethnicity. That means there's a higher rate of homicide offending among Black Americans than among white Americans. That has everything to do with the history of racial inequality that we have in our country. It has everything to do with the fact that We have concentrated urban poverty among disproportionately experienced by Black Americans and less so by white Americans. And that's what concentrates the experience and patterns of homicide disproportionately among Black Americans. This is not a problem that we can solve within the criminal justice system or by correcting the injustices of the criminal justice system, though certainly the injustices of the criminal justice system exacerbate these disparities and contribute to them. But these are problems that we need to tackle by investing in communities that have been underinvested in for centuries, and by really figuring out how do we tackle the sources of racial inequality in our society. So when it comes to the most serious violent crimes, there are disparities in criminal offending that need to be tackled outside of the criminal justice system. On the other hand, when it comes to the least serious kinds of crimes that we have, and I consider that, for example, to be represented by marijuana possession arrests, there we see that there's hardly any difference in the underlying pattern of behavior, but there is a lot of difference in the outcome in the criminal justice system. And that has a lot to do with how policing works. And when it comes to other kinds of, when we look at incarceration, that has a lot to do with how the criminal justice system processes people and treats them differently based on race and class. And so this is a report that we put out a couple of years ago, and we're updating actually this year. And this report presents a framework of the sources of disparity from within the criminal justice system. And the sources overlap a lot with what you've shared. So racial bias in the use of discretion, the disparate impact of race neutral policies and laws, policies that disadvantage low-income people, and given the overlap between race and class in our society, that means they disadvantage people of color, in particular Black Americans. And then finally, policies that exacerbate socioeconomic inequalities. The fact that, as one of my colleagues has once said, once the criminal justice system is done punishing you, you are not done being punished. You have a criminal record that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life in terms of employment, housing, voting rights. All of those things are going to be impacted. So I do want to note here for you that we've made a lot of progress in reducing these disparities. And this is a table that breaks this down, shows you the imprisonment rate, the number of people in prison per 100,000 people within each of these groups. And it shows you what the imprisonment looked like in the year 2000 versus 2021. And you can see that for almost all the groups here, except for white women, so except for white men, Black men and women, Latinx men and women, imprisonment rates have declined. And they've actually declined most substantially for Black Americans, for Black women, and for Black men. Still, we have disparities. Still, Black women are imprisoned at roughly twice the rate of white women. Still, Black men are far more likely to be imprisoned than white men. But we've made progress in reducing that disparity. And then, unfortunately, what you can also see is that we've not made progress in reducing the already low incarceration rates for white women, but even that is not nearly low enough. We instead, that's an unfortunate direction that things have gone in during this period, but we need to further reduce incarceration rates for white women and for white men. And this is something that sometimes comes up when we see really egregious cases of people being treated with apparent lenience, like we saw in reaction to the Brock Turner case. And there's so many other cases where there is an outcry that white Americans with privilege seem to be getting more favorable outcomes than people of color. And in those situations, we at the Sentencing Project try to encourage people to realize that the outcome that the white individual received, often is actually the kind of outcome we want people of color to receive as well. We don't want the punishment that they receive to be ratcheted up to be as excessive and unjust as we see for communities of color. But as Marie Gottschalk, who's a political science professor at University of Pennsylvania, has said, we in our country would have a mass incarceration problem even if we didn't lock up any people of color. If we just had the imprisonment rates that we have for white Americans and we didn't have imprisonment for others, we still would have a much higher rate of incarceration than our peer countries. So we need to go further, reducing incarceration across the board, but we can see that we've made progress, and we've especially made progress for Black Americans. So this is a cover of a report that has come out recently by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and it discusses racial disparities in incarceration. It's a really terrific resource which you can download and read for free. And one of the great points that they make in this report, and it's something that I think there's growing understanding about now, and I have a quote related to that here, is that when we talk about racial disparities, we don't just want to balance incarceration rates, or we don't just want to balance the level of exposure that people have to the criminal justice system by race. We want to overall reduce the footprint of incarceration. We want to reduce the footprint of policing. We don't just want to create equality across people by race and ethnicity. We want to realize that just scaling things back is something that needs to happen. And even that, sometimes even that is enough to reduce disparities. And so let me say, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. And this is a chart that we created at the Sentencing Project based on looking at the prison population by just the overall prison population and what percentage is Black, and that's the middle bar. 33% of the prison population is Black. In comparison, on the left, you can see 14% of the total U.S. population is Black. So you can see clear racial disparities, of course. But then the bar on the right is just looking at how many people are Black among people in prison that are serving sentences of at least 10 years or longer. And this is where you can see that it's a much higher proportion of people who are Black within this population, this segment of the prison population. And so that's why we know that if we can scale back extreme sentences, we can disproportionately reduce incarceration for Black Americans. So just focusing on extreme sentences can help to reduce some of the disparities that we see in incarceration in the United States. And, of course, when I mentioned life imprisonment earlier, and we know there that the disparities are at their most extreme. So 2/3 of the population in prison serving a life sentence are people of color. And when you look at the life without parole population, people who are serving sentences that are expected to result in their death unless they're commuted are their sentences commuted by a governor, or unless we change laws. Among that population, 55% are Black. And so tackling extreme sentences is very closely related to advancing racial justice in the criminal justice system. And so for that reason, we recommend a second look at all prison terms within 10 years of incarceration and capping prison terms to 20 years in almost all cases. So I'll stop there, and I would love to hear your questions and your reactions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ghandnoosh. So interesting and so important, this work. Thank you so much. I think Chelsea Thomas had a question. Chelsea, would you like to unmute and ask Dr. Ghandnoosh your question?
Dr. Ghandnoosh, I was just wondering, in that it was towards the beginning, the slide showing the reduction in really all categories of crimes that ended in, or I think the last year documented was 2020, and everything had gone down. But would that not be more due to the pandemic rather than was it an actual reduction in crime? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Thank you so much for that question. So let me pull that slide back up so we can all look at it together. I think that this is the slide that you're referring to.
Yes.
And okay, great. So this is actually, just to clarify, this is showing the prison population by different offense types. So if I actually showed you just crime rates, you would see the crime rates starting to fall down dramatically starting in the mid-1990s. But this is the proportion, this is the number of people in prison for these different offenses. And so that continued to increase even as crime rates were falling. But the second part of what you asked about is exactly right, that part of this has to do with the pandemic related reductions in the prison population that happened in 2020. And that's where you can see this dramatic this, very downwardly slanted line where I'm pointing at here with the violent population, with the population with violent convictions, and then with these other populations. So yes, during 2020, the prison population came down by about 15%. And before that, the average annual reduction in the prison population was 1%. And so when I said that it's just, roughly around 2% annual reduction in the prison population, that averages out all those different levels of decarceration. So it has a lot to do with, so yeah, most of that happened in 2020. And then there's been a big question of, are we going to maintain that level of decarceration and keep going, or are we going to build back up again? And
that was going to be my next question. Is
Yeah.
you guys, it's like, even from 2022, analyze the data to see if that started to creep back up, or is it just too soon to tell?
So we have the data for 2021, and we know that in 2021, the decarceration continued, but at a pretty modest pace, back to a more modest pace. So the prison population didn't shoot back up again, though it did in certain states in 2021. But overall, it continued its decline. The population in jail is a different story. In jails across the country in 2021, the numbers went back up again because jail populations started to fill up again after there was less concern, probably without unwarranted less concern about the pandemic in 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Martine, looks like you have a question.
Sure. Excellent presentation. Thank you. I learned a whole bunch. My question is, what countries would you suggest that we look to for examples on how to deal with the issues that you framed? What countries do you think are both comparable and also following strategies that you think might work in the United States? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words. So one country that I will often point to is Germany as one country that we can look at, where when it comes to extreme sentencing, one thing that's different about many countries that we want to compare ourselves to, that we think of ourselves as peer countries with, which is industrialized European countries, they have lower homicide rates than we do. So it's not a totally fair comparison across the board, but we can look and ask and say, what do they do when there is a homicide, for example? And what they do in many of these countries across Europe is they don't have life without parole sentences. They certainly don't have them for youth. They certainly don't have them for felony murder type convictions. But when someone has committed the most serious kinds of crimes, like a homicide, it results in typically a sentence of less than 15 years. And so very rarely are sentences handed out in excess of 15 years. And there are many other European countries that similarly will not imprison people for longer than 20 years. So for example, in Norway, it's a 21-year maximum sentence. And at that point, people are reevaluated and they continue to be incarcerated for additional periods, shorter periods of time if necessary. And so I think these are, great models. If we make a sort of apples to apples comparison by comparing crime types and how they're dealt with, I think European countries are typically what we think of ourselves as, peer countries too, and yet we're really outliers in terms of how we respond to the same crime. And I know that in the last couple of years, a number of organizations have actually taken people who work in the criminal justice space, like who work as prosecutors or who work in corrections, and they visited different European countries to get a sense of how things are unfolding there in terms of prisons and sentencing. And one of the feedback that I've heard that from that experience has been that it's been really interesting for folks on those trips to sometimes get questions from people that are incarcerated saying, this is what I did. About how long of a sentence do you think I would get in the United States for this crime? And the person gives a rough estimate. And it's usually just shocking to these individuals to learn that, like, for robbery, you might get 10, 20 years in the United States, whereas in these other countries, you're getting a far shorter sentence if you're even getting an incarceration sentence at all. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Again, we would encourage anyone who has a question, please let us know. Let Dr. Ghandnoosh know. I have one in the meantime. And that is, I think, for many of us who are, doing trial work, it's really helpful to have have any citations or any list of court opinions that cite to statistics showing that lengthy prison sentences have not shown to be a deterrent to others. In federal court, that's one of the 3553A factors, as we know, and in state court too, it always is relevant, and a good argument if we can show the court that there's no need for a lengthy sentence for the purpose of deterrent at a minimum. So I'm wondering if you have any information pertaining to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I shared a quote from Daniel Nagin about this, about deterrence, and that was actually pulled from a Washington Post op-ed that he wrote. But he is someone who's done quite a lot to review the academic research on this topic. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat that goes to a published article that he has that has a number of citations about how long sentences are not effective deterrents. And a lot of times the way criminologists and others talk about this is that they say it's not the severity of the punishment that matters, it's the certainty of the punishment that matters. And overall our forms of punishment that we have are not very certain in terms of how their likelihood of getting imposed on people, because they're unlikely to be apprehended. And then just in case it's helpful, I'm also going to link to a report that we put out a couple of years ago that's sort of a synthesis on research to date on recidivism for people who have served lengthy sentences, so that you have that as well.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. Looks like Dan has a question.
Hi, this is Dan Arshak. I understand the statistical comparison between the U.S. and Western European countries. I'm curious about what countries we actually do match up with in terms of the sentences that we mete out for various offenses. What other countries have sentences similar to ours?
Thanks for asking that. So let's see. I know that there's a website called the World Prison Brief, and I'll share a link to that in the chat as well. And so through that website, you can get a ranking of how US's incarceration rate compares to other countries. And, we're not among, typically it's like in terms of our incarceration rate overall, our peer countries are typically like Rwanda, Cuba. Okay, so, there's some inappropriateness in one of the images there. So these are not countries that we would typically consider to be our peer countries. But in terms of sentence lengths, I'm not sure. I know that in the fact that we're moved away from committing executions, but we're still doing that. And there's some other countries that are still, of course, our peers in that, like but then in terms of sentence lengths, I don't have a great answer to that question, so I'd have to follow up with you on that.
Thank you. I think Jackie, you have a question?
I do. Thank you for that. And thank you, Doctor. That was really an excellent question. And I was somewhat curious about that myself. The other thing I was thinking about is that, Doctor, you talked about the comparison of Norway and the well-known Norwegian system. And as I understand it, in the 1990s, when there was this worldwide increase in the incidence of crime and the incidence of violent crime, it seemed to me that the United States went one way with these tough on crime policies, whereas Norway at that same time went the opposite direction. So is it true that Norway, before implementing their more sort of enlightened or humane response to crime, had shared a similar 70 to 75% recidivism rate with the United States? And now today, the United States is still at something in the 70s in terms of recidivism rates, whereas Norway, as I understand it, is down at about 25%. And if that's true, if I'm correct about that, are there any studies to first verify that that is an accurate interpretation of the data? And if so, you know, I mean, does that translate? Is that translatable apples to apples or close to apples in your opinion?
What a great question. So I know that, I believe that Norway is a country that, you know, took a more rightward turn and then undid it. I think that sounds right to me. In terms of the in terms of the recidivism comparison, I don't know about the exact numbers, but I do know that overall, when it comes to recidivism, it's a really difficult thing to compare, even across states, let alone, you know, internationally. And that has to do so much with the fact that recidivism is a measure like arrest that is partly about crime, but it's so much about enforcement as well. It's so much about whether or not people are on community supervision and how they're treated while they're supervised. And so, for example, in the case of like in California, as you're very familiar with, you know, part of the realignment reforms that happened in California and part of why they were so effective in reducing California's prison population is because they've reduced how many people are just automatically put on parole supervision. And that meant that there are just fewer people that are likely to fall into the cracks and come back into the system again. So, you know, and I think Vincent Schiraldi, who is now working in the criminal justice space in Maryland and was previously at the Columbia Justice Lab, has written really well about community supervision and how it often ends up being a tripwire for people to get reincarcerated, and really recommends reducing community supervision terms. So I think, you know, so I guess my best answer to your question is that recidivism rates are extremely difficult to measure, and I think that so much of them is to measure and to compare, and I think so much of them so much of it is not just a measure of whether we're failing to rehabilitate people, but also whether we're just placing them under too much surveillance and are too quick to reincarcerate them and rearrest them.
Thank you for that.
Certainly that happens for sure. Did you have a question, Jackie? Also, Martine has a question too. Go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Is it to me or to Jackie? I'm sorry.
I think Jackie, she's on
Yep.
mute now. She looked like she was saying something.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm wanting to give others a chance, but anytime you want to come back to me, I've got lots of questions.
Okay, I think Martine had another question, and then we'll go to Jackie.
I'm also happy to defer to others if others have questions. I've already asked one, so.
You're up.
Okay. Let me ask you a question that has to do with reform, Doctor, and that is, why is it so difficult to get this message across? And do you have any suggestions about how we can get this message effectively across to a wider segment than simply the criminal legal reform community? I mean, this is an echo chamber probably on this call. How do we get this message across? You know, you see all sorts of distortions about crime rates and the need to keep very violent people incarcerated and all that sort of thing. And that dominates the public space. Do you have any strategies that you can recommend to us for trying to turn that tide?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So a couple of years ago, I actually wrote a piece in the Champion about the kinds of things that defense attorneys can do to tackle racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And part of that work is looking at bias in your own office and trying to think about ways to address the collateral consequences of mass incarceration within the communities that you are a part of, like your, within your alma maters, and addressing the school to prison pipeline and the schools that your kids go to. So those are some of the kinds of activities. And then the other, other kind of different type of work would be to try to be a bigger part of the advocacy campaigns and legislative reforms that are taking place. And so I think there are some really, great public defender offices, for example, that engage in that kind of work. But the way that that defense attorneys can really be very helpful is to help to change the public narrative around these issues, in particular because of your contact with people that are directly impacted by incarceration, as well as to some extent people who are victims and survivors and family members of victims. Because I think that right now there's such a dominant narrative that is beginning to get some cracks in it as we're hearing other perspectives. But I think that the dominant narrative is that victims always want extreme penalties, and we're beginning to understand that that's not the case, that over time victims' perspectives can change, and that there's, victims are not monolithic. Not everybody wants these extreme penalties. And so helping to sort of connect those voices to the broader movement is very helpful. And then, if that's too challenging, then potentially helping to raise the voices of your clients, in particular, people who have already served their prison terms, or that have served lengthy sentences, to help to bring to light what this experience is like and to humanize this population for people. Because I think the general public doesn't generally have a sense of, what is somebody like who has committed a homicide, and that actually, and many of you know probably from your work that people who've committed homicides and served decades in prison, many of them are like the rest of us. They are, they are people that were comfortable to be around, that would be comfortable to have in our communities. And so potentially, ways of lifting up those kinds of voices and stories would be helpful. And then another possibility is to think about directing the students that you work with and potentially some colleagues to work as prosecutors. We need to have a bigger reform prosecutor movement, and these offices where they are making some tremendous changes in terms of charging policies and the sentences that they struggle to be staffed in the way that they would need to be to carry out these reforms. And so thinking about ways to encourage people that are interested in the criminal justice reform movement to not just go into defense, but to also work on the other side as well.
Thank you. I had a question that, which is regarding the surprising statistic that most in prison are in more so for violent offenses than for perhaps drugs or property crimes. What is your response to those who say, well, we should have criminals who commit violent crimes behind bars?
Yeah, my response to that is that they're partly right. That is the idea of prisons. If we're going to have them, we should be incarcerating people who pose an imminent public safety risk. But we need to also recognize that that is not a fair or accurate characterization of many of these individuals that are in prison for a violent crime. In some situations, the crime that they committed was not one that they needed to go to prison for. A restorative justice program would have, especially if there are victims and survivors that were willing to participate, could have prevented their admission into prison and could have brought more closure to victims than incarceration. In other cases, generally as a society, and certainly victims would agree that incarceration is necessary, like with the most serious crimes like homicide. But then the key question is, for how long? For how long should someone serve in prison when they committed these kinds of crimes? And especially if we know that after 10, 15, 20 years, they are no longer a public safety risk. If in some situations the victim does not want them to be incarcerated any longer, why are we locking them up still? Why are we committing that injustice? Why are we throwing money away in that kind of way instead of investing in preventing that kind of harm from happening in the first place?
Yes, thank you. Jackie, I think you had another question.
Yeah, I did, but I'm going to put that one aside and piggyback onto the beginning of the answer to the last question, Doctor, where you say that folks who say that people who commit or are convicted of committing violent crimes are partly right that they should be locked away. I just bristle at something like that, but I understand where you're coming from. I wonder, are the statistics about recidivism for that population something that the defense community, or the reform community, I should say more specifically, can use to address that sort of common misconception that people who commit a crime that we label as violent, for example, a robbery or other kinds of violent crime, and including murder, that perhaps there isn't an actual need to incarcerate in order to provide safety to the community or to deter future misconduct?
I appreciate that question, Jackie. I think that there's a growing interest now in restorative justice movements. And so, for example, the organization Common Justice has been working in the New York prosecutor's offices in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and other parts of the country as well, I believe. And they're taking on very serious violent crimes, and where victims are interested in a restorative justice process. And so we know that that model is possible, that there are people that are interested in those kinds of alternatives. And in many places, we just haven't invested in that possibility. And we also know that in many situations, when we look at resentencing hearings for people that have served decades in prison and are being evaluated, given a second look, sometimes victims support them, sometimes victims are neutral, and sometimes victims are opposed. And when you look at those cases where they are opposed, it's clear that we've not done enough to restore that individual to the extent possible. We've not done enough to help them heal from the trauma that they've experienced. And so much of these extreme penalties is just about offering severity of punishment and is not about offering services and programs that can help people to heal and recover. And so that's important, even when there is an experience of imprisonment, to help people rehabilitate as soon as possible, but also to invest in helping victims to heal so that they can be comfortable as possible, and sometimes supportive of people who are not a public safety risk being released.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Not hearing anyone. We really appreciate your attendance here today. And I'm now will turn it over to Jackie.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. I want to thank you both and for such an enlightening and inspirational discussion. Dr. Ghandnoosh, you know you're such an important part of the Decarceration Committee and the decarceration community as a whole. Even in just this hour, we could see that reform of this inhumane and ineffective system is necessary. And evident from the work of the Sentencing Project, thanks to you and others, it's possible. I think it's just a matter of getting the information out. So we really appreciate you investing your time with us and helping us to kind of harness the resources that we have here to try and assist in that effort. Many thanks to you, Dr. Ghandnoosh, and to the Sentencing Project. Thanks to Seth, Chazin for moderating this discussion, to Vanessa and the staff at NACDL for making this possible, and to the viewers who joined us and helped make this an especially engaging experience.